Okay, welcome back to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to drop the bead and pour white lightning straight onto your brain. And we are recording in the afternoon, so I feel free to drink my own white lightning. Today, we are going to talk about a number of things leading into me talking about my part of Charles Murray and coming apart, which is going to take a couple of episodes because of the detail that he goes into and what he goes into. But we're going to start off with a little bit of fitness talk because I was recently asked for advice and assistance by someone about losing weight and getting in shape without being able to lift weights because of heart issues. And specifically, this person's doctor said that it will raise your blood pressure too much, and that's not good because of your heart condition.
Yes. Okay, so that's gonna be our first real topic of the day. I just wanted to throw a couple things in there. This is not a disease that should not be named or medicine that should not be named episode, but I did a thing on Tuesday. I went and got my antibodies done. So 11 months post-infection, and we're still going strong on antibodies. So thumbs up for the human immune system.
Are you thicker than Joe Rogan? Can you whip it out and compare?
Oh, I don't. You know? I didn't see Joe Rogan's. He didn't actually show it on air.
No, he just talked about it. Yeah,
he said it was really fat, and then he said Jamie's was even fatter. So I don't know. Our antibody line contest may have to be done in person if we ever get that famous.
All right.
But yeah, I did a thing, and the only thing I wanted to say about that was if there was only a test we could take to determine whether you actually needed to do a medical procedure to raise that number, there was only a test that costs $38 at CVS and takes 10 minutes. I mean, if there was one, man, that would change the game. I think
that would be really interesting.
It would be really interesting if we could just, gather a little bit more information before we make a big medical decision. But
if only we lived in such a utopia.
Yeah, all these population numbers and all the statistics we've been throwing out lately. And there's only really one data point that matters, and it's where your body is. And you can actually test for that. And it's cheap and available and accurate. But that's just me. I don't make $36 billion last year like certain companies did. So, all right, on to health, which is also a crappy industry when you really break it down. So your person that came to you has doctor's orders not to do any resistance training because of her blood pressure. And she wants to lose weight and get healthier and help her blood pressure, which actually losing weight just in and of itself would help with that. So I guess we should start with disclaimers. We are not doctors. I am technically a health professional by degree and certifications, but consult your doctor before starting any exercise or diet regimen, so to make sure you're healthy enough to do it. But onto the subject of blood pressure. This is where we're not giving direct fitness advice. So again, talk to your doctor about it. But this is where I would disagree with this particular doctor, because it's a knee-jerk reaction to an acute physiological effect versus what the training itself actually does for you. I guess I'll just give an overview and then I'll bring up my sources. But when you do lift weights, do resistance training, you do experience, well, any kind of activity is going to raise your blood pressure because the heart's pumping harder. There's only so much elasticity of the blood vessels, so therefore the pressure in those blood vessels from the pumping of the heart and the greater cardiac output is going to create a temporary uptick in that blood pressure. Just walking up and down the stairs is going to do that. So that's why you're supposed to be relaxed and sit down for a little bit before you take your resting blood pressure when you go to the doctor. So that way you don't get a higher reading, because it just does it when you're up and moving around. Now, resistance training, it's kind of an exponential number on top of that. In fact, leg press and deadlifts and these big multi-joint exercises can spike up to, I think it's a systolic of over 700 if you're pushing some serious weight and you're doing a Valsalva to keep your back from collapsing.
Yeah, I can attest to that personally, because before I discovered what was going on, I was having fatigue and lightheadedness issues, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I got a wrist monitor, because that kind of fatigue and lightheadedness could be a blood pressure issue, a low blood pressure issue. And I checked while I was doing leg press, and yeah, it spiked up to 600, but it didn't stay there very long.
No, it's basically only during the lift. And then after that, it's only the spike of actually having a higher heart rate and a higher cardiac output. So that big giant spike exists. And so when you have a doctor who doesn't know a whole lot about preventative medicine, they're kind of stuck in their treating the illness kind of mode. They don't understand. They don't make the connection. They can understand if it's brought to them and probably be like, oh yeah, the moment. But they're not trained in, and they're not. They get stuck in this lens of looking directly at the problem versus actually all the things around the problem. And that spike in blood pressure during that moment actually creates a systemic effect that over the long term will chronically lower your blood pressure, because you are stretching and flexing that tissue. And when we go into the sources, you'll see some of that. There's a lot of mechanisms involved. First of all, just a stronger heartbeat is one of the mechanisms involved. The others are again, the stretching and flexing of those blood vessels. When you talk about the venous return in your legs, only about a third of it is from the pump of your heart. Another third is from the actual kind of motion inside the blood vessel itself. And then the rest is actually because of the contraction of the muscles around the blood vessels. So we get some venous return from our legs because of the contraction of the leg muscles, which is that's one reason to get up and move around all the time, where the blood's going to pool down there. So that temporary spike is what he's afraid of, whereas the chronic effect could in turn help this person. All right. Now, the data on this is limited, but it is positive. And it's limited just because it's realistically something people are just now exploring. Aerobic exercise has been explored since the existence of aerobic exercise in cardiac issues. But as far as resistance training, so many people were afraid of it because of that spike and that acute higher blood pressure, that they just made that assumption that it's bad for you, and it just wasn't explored until a later date. But yeah, that's where I would disagree with this particular doctor, is you are actually not thinking of the chronic effects of resistance training. You're only thinking of that initial spike. Now let's look at those numbers we were talking about with that leg press of a spike of 700. That's in a healthy individual. So obviously raising your blood pressure from resistance training doesn't have a deadly effect initially, because I mean that spike is well above what we would call healthy blood pressure.
Oh yeah.
Probably about it's pretty close to 7 times what we would call healthy blood pressure. But yet it immediately drops back down, and no harm, no foul. It was just there during the action. Other than some people getting a little bit lightheaded because of that spike. Now, when you talk about someone who has a little bit of hypertension, you might need to be a little bit more careful. But if we know 700 is not deadly in a normal person, well, who's to say 700 is deadly in that same hypertensive individual? Hypertension doesn't kill you because of the acute effects. Hypertension kills you over time because of effects such as The the,
It's
the
that
fir-
it's that constant strain
yeah,
on
the
the
further
vessels.
hardening of the arteries is one. The left ventricular hypertrophy, which is the left ventricle, which is the one that actually pumps the blood into the body. So you got four chambers. Most high school anatomy here. One gets the blood from the system, pumps it to the lungs, or it goes down to the right ventricle. That pumps it out to the lungs. Well, it comes back from the lungs, goes in the left atria, which goes down to the left ventricle, and then pumps to the body. So there's your order there: right atria, right ventricle, lungs, left atria, left ventricle, body. And that left ventricle, that's a muscle. So if it's working harder over a long period of time, it's going to grow just like any other muscle. And that wall gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And it has two effects. The first one is it grows both directions, so out and in. So it actually makes that chamber smaller. So then you've got to have more heartbeats to pump out the same amount of blood because the chamber's smaller. It's just a smaller pump to pump it out. And the other effect is the electrical signal that goes through your heart goes through that muscle tissue, and a thicker muscle tissue throws off the signal. So then you're more likely to go into a VFib or a tachycardia type situation because of that, which is actually how a lot of bodybuilders die, because they have a lot of that hypertrophy of that left ventricle because they're taking anabolic drugs while they're exercising a lot. So those two effects can cause the long-term basically the adverse effects of that. And then the high blood pressure causes that wall to work harder. So therefore, we know from training, working harder causes more growth, and more growth in that situation causes those other two problems. So high blood pressure doesn't kill you with a spike unless you pass out at the wheel and die. But it doesn't kill you with a spike. It kills you with the chronic effect. So if we can spike the system to lower the chronic load that this thing has to do, then that's actually going to be a positive net effect. And that's why resistance training, that's the mechanism to which resistance training actually can help, is that spike causes the blood vessels to become more pliable because it's just like stretching, right? It's just like stretching any other tissue. And that in turn, over time, lowers your blood pressure. So you become more efficient with your heartbeats, and you stretch these blood vessels out, which actually kind of rejuvenates them to some degree.
And
Go ahead.
I can't remember if I've mentioned this before, but I should probably be careful here. But I had a client when I was working at a box gym who was an older Indian gentleman, and he was so proud of his children, because this is a very cultural thing. If anyone who knows Indian people, especially older Indian people, he had 5 children, and every time I saw him, he would talk about them because all 5 of them were doctors, and he was so proud of that. My wife had a boss who was the black sheep, the failure of his family, because he was only a software engineer. Now, granted, he was a VP and he made more than his siblings, but his siblings were all doctors or lawyers. So those were the ones his parents were most proud of. But this client told me that his children told him to go find a personal trainer he could trust, because they told him that all of their experience with nutrition and fitness was all in like a 1-hour semester class, is that they had practically none, which frankly makes sense because they have more important things to spend their time on when you're trying to do MD training.
Oh yeah, and I've read some of the material too, because those that have been following, my wife's a doctor as well, and I read the nutrition book that she has sitting on the shelf behind me, and I don't think this thing's been updated in 30 or 40 years. It was really, really, really outdated. Some things that we just take for granted now.
Well, and which I appreciated that his children had told him that, because I mean, that's what we tell people when we get out of our wheelhouse is, I know enough about nutrition to be able to tell someone, that sounds like you might have a vitamin deficiency. You should go check with a professional nutritionist or doctor. I'm not giving them nutrition advice saying, oh yeah, you have vitamin deficiency, you need to do this. No, I know enough to know when it's out of my wheelhouse and when they need some more expert opinion. Or, I had this swimmer that I've been training, and his low back was hurting more than it should have, based on what we'd done. And I told him, all right, if this doesn't go away in a day or two, you need to go see a doctor, because you may have something more wrong here than just what I'm seeing, you
Mm-hmm.
know, because that's when it gets out of my wheel. I know what I know and I know what I don't know, which is important.
Uh, and it really is actually hard to find a doctor that understands
Mm-hmm.
exercise and nutrition. And especially since so much has changed over the last, I'd say, 20 years in that industry.
Yeah.
But we got the Mayo Clinic here. Kind of wanted to start here because it's kind of an overview, but I did get some of the nitty gritty type stuff. But some of the same things I just said. It causes a temporary increase in blood pressure. This increase can be dramatic, but it also can have long-term benefits to blood pressure that outweigh the risk of temporary spike for most people. And again, they've got to put that qualifier on there for most people.
Well, hold on before you go on. To me, scroll up a bit. The most important part of this, just right off the bat, to me is that last sentence there. Check with your doctor before starting a weightlifting program to discuss any precautions or special considerations. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a yes or no question. I mean, the first word there, maybe. This is not a yes or no question.
Mm-hmm.
You might have one of my favorite clients was, if I recall correctly, he was 78 years old. He'd had a bypass surgery and he had a pacemaker.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it was my greatest professional accomplishment, I felt, because of where I was able to get him. All right. So 78 years old, he'd had bypass surgery. He had a pacemaker. He had special considerations. It wasn't a yes or no question. His doctor told him to find a fitness program that he could do to help him, you know, uh, improve and maintain so that he wouldn't have continued problems. And that's what it was. Is I did not train him the way I trained this kid who was a catcher, trying to get into a ball. Okay.
I'll give a great example of special consideration. If you're a trainer out there and you're doing high intensity interval training with someone on beta blockers, you're an idiot. Because the purpose of high intensity interval training is to spike their heart rate for a long-term benefit, just like we were talking about. But if they're on beta blockers, there is no spike because they can't get their heart rate up that high. So, but you still see it because sometimes all they have is a hammer for every nail, and high intensity interval training looks cool. But yeah, it's a special consideration. That person is on beta blockers. So we can skip that step and say, okay, well, we've got to build your body up and actually make your heart healthier in another way. So we need that lower intensity, get you to the top end of what your beta blockers will allow, and then kind of keep a good pace going on. But when it comes to blood pressure, again, special considerations, which actually this article goes into with these 4 bullet points here. But not yes or no, because we do know from the literature that it has these long-term benefits, which ultimately, once you've started and you start to see these long-term benefits, these considerations become less and less. Because now I've gotten it down a little bit, I don't need to account for as much. So regular exercise, including moderate weightlifting, provides many health benefits, including lowering blood pressure. Now, the special considerations, they always say this has actually nothing to do with your blood pressure, but every single source I looked at said this: learn to use proper form when lifting to reduce risk of injury. Duh. All right. Don't hold your breath. So we talked about a Valsalva. So actually, if I did have a client who had blood pressure issues, we would probably avoid this at first, right?
I think we should explain what that means. The Valsalva. Okay, the Valsalva maneuver, for anyone who doesn't know.
Well, the simple one is you hold your nose and blow out against your nose like you would do on an airplane and to pop your ears. But in lifting, you would take a deep breath and hold it with your throat. So it actually creates an air pocket, pushing your diaphragm down, air pocket in your lungs. and that air pocket in your lungs pushing your diaphragm out supports your rib cage and your spine. So all of that pressure that's in your gut and in your torso is one of the things that stabilizes your spine from collapsing forward.
Yeah. If you watch Olympic lifting and you can hear them do it because they give a they're not being brotacular there. They're trying to take that deep breath and clench it down and hold it to stabilize their core because they're about to throw 300 kilos over their head.
Yeah, and this is where you're going to get the biggest spike of blood pressure because the whole key to the Valsalva is pressure. And in your torso happens to be your heart, right? So we are creating this high pressure situation in order to save our back in that situation and your rib cage. But if you have a blood pressure issue, probably something you would want to avoid. So that actually eliminates some exercises from your repertoire, at least at a heavy load. So you're probably not going to be deadlifting right off the bat.
And you're certainly not going to be doing heavier weight, lower rep kind of things.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you're not lifting. It's you're modifying what and how you're lifting.
Well, and we go back to bullet point number 1, learn to use proper form to reduce injury. That's a good time to spend time learning proper form because you're forced to use the light weight anyways.
Yeah.
So you can be working on your deadlifts. You can be working on the hinge pattern with a weight light enough that you can breathe normally when you lift it. And then as you get healthier over time, because you're A, losing weight, B, you're getting more muscle mass, C, hopefully those long-term blood pressure effects are starting to take effect, then you can just, all you have to do is add the breath and boom, you can improve your performance after that. Lift lighter weights more times. That goes into what we're just saying. Heavier weights require more strain. Now I will say you can get away with more weight if you're doing a single joint exercise, such as a bicep curl or a tricep extension, anything where you're not going to have to hold that Valsalva. And I would stress that single leg exercises would probably be a good addition, even though they're technically heavier on your leg, because you got twice your body weight on that appendage. You don't have a core load that's heavier. And when we're talking about this blood pressure spike, that core load is actually really key. So twofold effect, you can just get a better workout from a resistance training standpoint because you're doing more resistance with a single leg exercise. But also, as we talked about with that venous return from your legs, if we improve that by improving the musculature of our legs, then that's going to have a positive net blood pressure effect as well, because you're not going to have that pooling down there. There's going to be a nice flow of the blood versus it pooling down there and having to, it would need a harder pump from the heart to get back up. So another cause of the higher blood pressure. So we've got a twofold effect. So you can challenge your muscles and you can go, I'm going to use the word, we can go heavy on certain exercises as long as they don't have a heavy core load. And then alternate between upper body and lower body exercise to let your muscles rest. Now that one, be careful, because if we're doing circuit weight training, you could actually have a greater cardiovascular effect by going upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower in succession, because your blood rushes to your arms and your blood rushes to your legs and your blood rushes to you only got so much blood in your body. Yeah. And it's going to keep responding to that. And that, you see actually people get real dizzy and pass out that are new at training by doing upper, lower in the same circuit. Now it's a good advanced technique, or even moderate to advanced technique, because now you're actually challenging your cardiovascular system. But in the initial stages, if you have a medical condition, we just want to slightly challenge it. We don't want to crush it. But yeah, that's Mayo Clinic's kind of little write up on it. I think your person, client or whatever, should print this out and take it to their doctor and say, hey, what do you think of this? Because it's a good little, easy to read. Your doctor that only wants to spend 5 minutes with you anyways can still read it in 30 seconds. And basically it forces them to answer to it, because now it's not your opinion. It's not my opinion as a trainer. It's not the client's opinion trying to WebMD this. This is Dr. Sheldon Sheps, MD, right here, his opinion, right? And I
Yeah.
wish he would have sourced more, because
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, luckily this is actually a subject I've dealt with a lot, so I knew where to look. But we we were, let's see, let me get the name of this one so everybody can look. Cardiovascular effects and benefits of exercise. So uh, Frontiers in Cardiovascular Medicine is the magazine, 2018. So it's relatively new. So we got updated data, right? And then they've got a whole section on the blood vessel, excuse me, blood pressure effects. Now here they really talk about what are probably the mechanisms of it. And the first one, this first paragraph here, is talking about just the average effects over the studies, and how big the magnitude of that effect is. So just a 1 point loss reduces heart failure events per 100,000 person years. So it's actually a high magnitude, even though it seems like such a small number
Hmm.
in that reduction. But then
But
also,
again, I would say that's because we're, as you mentioned earlier, we're talking about a chronic effect, not an acute effect when we're talking about blood pressure. So
mhm,
yeah, that number, that 1 millimeters of mercury, that's a small number, but it's a small number over the entirety of
mhm,
your life. It's like every time that heart is beating.
mhm. Uh, did I repeat Mayo Clinic? Oh, it's just another Mayo Clinic article that says a lot of the same things. Reviews some of the things in this journal article. Uh, how much do you need? Now, one of the key points in this one is the best effect is uh, a combination of cardiovascular and resistance training, which, of course, again, is a nice little, of course, right?
Basic eighth grade health.
Yeah. Uh, there was one. Let me. Okay, so the summary on this article was one I thought was very important, because this is acute and chronic effects of aerobic and resistance training on the ambulatory blood pressure. So they got all their graphs. It's a meta-analysis, so they brought a lot of studies into it. But the summary here, uh, after all of that, and so just to paraphrase what they did, is aerobic exercise had, of course, a wealth of data for improvements in blood pressure. And then resistance training had some data, but it was not as conclusive because of just the lack of studies. But they were able to determine that it doesn't hurt, right? So the risk isn't there that doctors think is there. And that's kind of the main takeaway from this article right here in particular. And it was referenced in this other one that I brought up here. And so if there's the risk isn't there that the doctors originally thought was there, which is the actual argument here, right? Don't do this because you're going to die, is what your client's told in
Yep.
summary,
Yep.
right? Well, that's not true. And so that not being true, even though there's not a wealth of evidence that it's going to improve the blood pressure like
Hmm.
aerobic exercise, there are other important complements to complementary benefits, like the osteomuscular benefits,
Hmm.
muscle mass, bone mass, uh, neurological effects of resistance training, uh, the the blood sugar benefits of resistance training, because
Yeah.
you become more sensitive to, or more receptive to insulin, because your body resistance training is inherently glycolytic, so you need glycogen, and so your muscles say, give me more glycogen, so you become less insulin resistant. So all the other effects we get from resistance training, which we know are beneficial, you're losing that if you avoid it, and you're not
Yeah.
going to get it from standard long distance aerobic exercise. So the just the fact that it's not going to hurt you is a big deal, because
Yes.
you want all those other benefits, and the doctor that's scared of it is not up to date on the current
Right.
literature.
And that was my primary concern there, that last thing you mentioned, because as I've mentioned before, one of my primary concerns when I'm training someone is noticeable results,
Mhm.
because you need that positive reinforcement to keep you going. Okay. Now, especially if we're talking about what I usually deal with, which are desk jockeys, which need to get in shape. If you're in the overweight or obese categories, you have got to get that weight down, and it's hard
Mhm.
and it's annoying and it's frustrating. Doubly so if you have psychologically conditioned yourself to use yummy food, the chicken fried steak and double mashed potatoes as your psychological crutch to give
Mhm.
you that nice little boost to feel better. So even doubly so. But if you can see, the quicker you can see results, the better you're going to feel. And that's just going to create this positive feedback loop. You've talked about how you can put yourself into uh, a negative condition if life sucks and you hate it every time you're trying to exercise,
Mhm.
right? That's just going to make it harder to exercise every time. It's going to compound the difficulty. Well, if you say, hey, I'm starting to look better. Hey, I'm noticing the weight loss, more than just the scale, but if you can notice it too.
Mhm.
Um,
Before and after pictures are huge. Just
yes,
my own
yes,
anecdote is you feel like you're in a rut sometimes,
yeah,
and the scale isn't a good indicator if you're already at a healthy weight. Uh, and it's hard to do your own body fat measurements and things. But even after I had the my own cardiac issues in 2017, had to go in the hospital a few times for that. I gained a lot of weight after that because I couldn't exercise, because I couldn't even get my heart rate up
yeah.
for a little bit. Uh, and comfort food is, I do love me some fried chicken.
It's comforting. That's why it's
It
called
is
comfort.
comforting. It hits those dopamine centers, and so I put on a little weight. But even in the comeback process from that, the weight kind of plateaued after the first few pounds. But I'd taken some before pictures, and I just decided, I had marked on the floor where I stood and everything. I just decided to take another picture and put it, not just look at the two, but put them actually side by side. And I was like, holy shit, I did make a lot of progress.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that spiked another progress kind of cycle, because all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is working. I'm good, but none of those measurables other than the actual visual helped. And so those before and after, even if you hate the way you look in it,
Mm-hmm.
that's actually part of it. You
Yeah.
want that, because if when you see it next to something you hate a little less, then it creates that psychological
It
kind
gives
of
you a
spike.
reason to keep going. And that's the trouble with purely aerobic exercise. It is much harder. We've talked about this before, but weight loss isn't easy, but it is a simple equation. It's
Mhm.
simply calories in versus calories out, right? So that part is simple, but it's not easy. And you're going to get, I don't know if you might want to talk about the witchcraft of this, but there's something called the afterburn, which is when you do resistance training, you get a continual burn of calories as your muscles remodel themselves,
Mhm.
in a nutshell.
Well, I mean, what you eat as far as your food has two purposes. It's energy, and it's substrates for the constant remodeling that is your body. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're not ingesting calcium, obviously your bones are going to suffer from it, because they're constantly remodeling, and other parts of your body use calcium and they get it from the bones. So if you're not ingesting enough calcium, you're going to have a net loss of bone. So uh, the constant remodeling of your body is one of the purposes of your food. So why you really need to get enough protein and enough fats, because those are the building blocks of your body basically, and the carbohydrates provide the energy, or the breakdown of those protein and fats to provide energy as well. That's why things like keto work also. Now, carbohydrates are the most efficient. But when you have a net increase, obviously, over what your body needs to remodel, then also your energy needs of the day, then it gets stored as fat. or pooped out, depending on how efficient your metabolism is. But stored as fat is survival because we didn't get to eat every day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're actually built to store fat. People who don't store a lot of fat, they probably wouldn't have lived very long back in the day. So it's actually counter adaptive. So that's why more of us are better at storing fat than the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, calories in, calories out, in the proper building blocks. And if you create damage to that system, temporary damage, causing the just right temporary damage, causing your body to remodel and come back better from it, that obviously takes those resources, which is ingested food. So that's part of it. Now, might be going off a little different than what you were saying, because I think what I just said was on par with what you were saying, right? Now there's the other, what's the afterburn is EPOC, excess post exercise oxygen consumption. All right. So if I put myself in a high intensity state and I use up all the substrates in my body, as much as I can of the substrates in my body, in a high intensity exercise situation, it's an aerobic activity to replenish those stores. So your body's breaking down fats, and you need oxygen. So it's excess post exercise oxygen consumption, right? So you need more oxygen post exercise to replenish those energy stores within your body. And the higher intensity that is, and the duration of that determines how long that lasts. That's why things such as Tabata work, because it's 8 sets of 20 seconds of work, 10 seconds of rest. And in those 10 seconds, you do not replenish your store. So it's a constant beating down of those, of the glycogen in your system, as well as your, the immediate energy stores, which is the creatine phosphate. So, when you deplete that, your body aerobically within the rest time replenishes that, and that's when you start going into fat oxidation as well. So the more you deplete in a short period of time, the longer that excess afterburn type effect lasts. So I think I don't think that's where you were going, but that's the other, what we call afterburn as well. So
yeah, that's part of what I was talking about. That's why I wanted you to explain the witchcraft and the difference between that and why you want both aerobic and anaerobic, because when you do aerobic exercise, I think most people know you plateau. Okay, that's what happens. That's supposed to happen. That's part of your body's energy usage mechanism, right? So you plateau for good reason, but when you're talking about uh, weight loss, fat loss, that plateau is a problem. Okay, so it's good because you're improving your aerobic system, but it's a problem when you're talking about weight loss and fat loss. It becomes much more difficult. It requires much more work to get that same effect from a steady state aerobic activity than the short-term high intensity that you were just talking about.
Well, and it depends on there's so many effects to exercise that you can go back to the standard. It depends, right? So I'm real big on, a few times a week, taking a long walk. It not only does it give you a little aerobic boost, but it's a good kind of mental reset. If you get out in nature, first of all, get outside. Hopefully there's some sun out, fresh air. And I like to do it alone so I can kind of just get in a zone. And I switch back and forth between listening to a podcast or listening to music, and just relax while doing something physical. So that there's the mental part of it. But then the other part of it is long, slow kind of cardio activity does have physiological effects that your high intensity conditioning doesn't. So from a heart standpoint, how well your heart handles the cardiac output, your interval training, is going to be equivalent to a certain amount of long, slow anaerobic training. But when you look on the cellular level, things like mitochondrial density improve better with your long, slow distance work because they're inherently aerobic in nature. And the more you can be in that state, the more your body's going to be stimulated to reproduce that. So there are benefits to both. Now, if you're short on time, obviously you're going to get more benefit out of the higher intensity. But man, make some time for a long walk or something active that lasts for a long period of time. Even do your own lawn. Quit hiring a service. Something like that. Just so you can stay in that higher movement state and moderate heart rate state for an extended period of time. So there's benefits to it. But as you were saying, when we're talking about bang for our buck, now we do want to include some higher intensity activity. And then when we're talking blood pressure specifically, those spikes in blood pressure are actually needed. The long-term effects of you're not getting as good of a stretching effect on the system as a whole, the cardiac system as a whole, the blood vessels and all, with that slower distance type work.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap this part up. We've covered a lot of ground, more than we actually intended.
Yeah. Let's just summarize with I would say to that person or anybody who has this situation, print that Mayo Clinic article out and challenge your doctor. And what we actually do need to some degree is a little bit of education on the patient's part. Because one reason doctors can get away with this crap of not knowing a thing about actual preventative health is the fact that they kind of have a monopoly on the market. So what we need to do is start challenging them and making them answer for some of these things and finding the doctors who do step up to the challenge versus just blowing you off and saying, I'm the doctor, I'm the expert.
Yeah.
Just like we almost everything we've talked about when it comes to listening to the expert, you have to challenge the expert. They have to prove they're expert and they have to answer you in a way you can understand. And so I think that's part of the overall solution.
Absolutely. All right. Well,
sorry, COVID.
Yep. I wish. I've been walking around licking shopping carts, hoping I can finally get it.
Take an antibody test. Maybe you had it and you didn't know.
You know what? I keep meaning to do that, and I keep forgetting to find a place to get it done. But
$38 at CVS.
All right, I'll go do that next time I have to get my brain medicine refilled. All right, quick potty break.
Yep, quick potty break, and we'll pivot to the annoying.
Everybody's favorite terrible quarterback.
All right, we're back, and I bit the bullet. I took one for the team, and I watched the Colin Kaepernick Netflix documentary. Colin in black and white. It was interesting, I should say, and not in a I would watch it again mode, but that's okay. I took lots of notes. I have 6 pages of notes, one for each episode. And I'm trying to think of where to start, because do you want me to just go in order of the episodes, or because I kind of want to talk about the NFL as a whole and players in the NFL as a whole, because of our old buddy right here is a good example of of exactly some of my problems with this whole narrative. As a whole. Because even I watched a little Hotep Jesus last night, and he kind of disappointed me a little bit because they kept calling the NFL the plantation. Now they can't stand Colin either, but they kept calling it the plantation. And there's this narrative as the NFL football player as a slave.
And it's offensive as hell. I think I've mentioned this before, that comparing Donald Trump to Hitler and calling him a Nazi is a frickin' insult to the 12-ish million people who were exterminated in the concentration camps of the
Mhm.
Nazis. Okay, it's an insult to the men who had to storm, the beaches on D-Day. It's a freaking insult. It's not even remotely comparable. There's a big difference between saying we're on the road to and we are. Okay, if you want to make the case that Donald Trump is, Hitler in 1933 because X, Y, and Z 1, 2, 3, fine, make that case. But that's not what's being said.
Yeah, and there was a lot of comparisons that were slightly accurate. And okay, he was a populist like Hitler was. He was a nationalist like Hitler was in some ways, not as to the same degree, but I'm just drawing the lines. He was a germaphobe, which was one of the red flags, as people forget that Hitler used national health as part of his climb to power and his eradicating of certain people. So those similarities existed, and people just kind of took that and ran with it. But you back to the NFL.
Well, hold on a second. I want to share one of the most, to make my point. Whoops. Hold on. Just, no, stop that. There, no, stop that. Whoops. Why do you have to enable sharing every single time? That's annoying.
I don't know. Here you go.
All right. This is one of the most famous or infamous, if you will, photos of a slave. Okay. This is an actual slave. This is not, this is not someone at the NFL Combine. Last I checked, measuring your wingspan and your vertical jump did not leave grotesque scars on your back. This is a famous photo now because Ken Burns used it quite a bit in his Civil War documentary, but it was also famous at the time because this was an escaped slave and his picture was taken, and it worked a lot like Uncle Tom's Cabin. The reason Uncle Tom's Cabin was so infamous at the time was because it showed the cruelty. You couldn't hide behind euphemisms anymore. And that's what this picture did, is you can't hide behind euphemisms when you see something like that.
Well, and that was one of the main things about the civil rights movement was it made something that even racist white people, even people that are racist white people, couldn't get behind public. So basically they were making lines. So the police would have to hose them or send the dogs or whatever. And even your racist, your casual racist white person had to say no.
Yeah.
We can't do that.
One of the many,
just making them have a separate, fountain or whatever. I'm cool with that, but spraying them down with a hose, nope, that's too far. We got to stop.
Well, one of the many problems with racism being used for everything is we've lost the term bigoted or prejudiced. There are degrees and there are differences of, okay, well, I'm not racist because I'm not William Wallace. I'm not a KKK member. I'm not going to go burn a cross on someone's front lawn. But you know what? Yeah, though there is a difference. There is inferiority. So I'm okay with the status quo. What's the big deal? Okay. But then when you see that, it slaps you in the face and says, no, it's not just separate but equal. This is what is going on. This is what Jim Crow is. This is what the racist South is. And you can't ignore it anymore because we have videographic evidence.
Yeah, we're going to get to some of that too as we go on. The first episode probably, first and third episodes were probably the most infuriating. Second one was actually not too bad because it actually, when you're talking about, so the whole thing is centered around, for those that haven't watched it or aren't going to watch it, it's him in high school, going into high school as a freshman, and basically goes through his 4 years of high school and the different quote unquote struggles he went through, or growing up processes he went through, and how those are good visualizations of the systemic racism of the United States of America, especially where he was. But some of the stuff in the second episode were when he was trying to get on the football team. I think we even can identify as, and we'll bring up even NFL examples of that, I think. And it's like, well, that exists, but it not necessarily because you're black. There's a lot of other reasons why that phenomenon you're describing here exists. But in the first one, it opens up with the NFL Combine. It's kind of out of order. It's the only reference to this in there. But one thing about this show is, as I'm watching it, I'm actually predicting the next part every time, because it's if you took a Robin DiAngelo book like White Fragility or Are We Even Equal, and threw a couple of pages of Kindy in between as bookmarks, you would have this show with visualizations that he made in the story. But with introducing the Combine, first of all, note number one, there were only black people in his depiction of the Combine as players, and there were only white coaches is his depiction of the people doing the measuring and stuff. So he introduces it as like a slave trade on the block, and he uses the word specifically as an intro to power dynamics. So now we're talking critical race theory, where everything's a hierarchy based on power dynamics. So they kind of go balls deep right on the beginning to get the critical theories as the benchmark for it all. And and then he goes into, and this is the lead into him as a young athlete. And he says, this is a quote from him: football was, as a youth football was grooming him for the system. So basically he's being socialized into this I'm a slave mentality, and these are my masses.
Well, it's a double victimhood narrative there, because grooming is a term associated with pedophiles.
Well, that's what he's talking about. As a child,
Mm-hmm.
he was being groomed for this system.
So he's doubly a victim now.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he was raised in a very Rockefeller type upper middle class neighborhood and family.
See, they don't depict him as upper middle class. It's kind of typical suburban. And this is one comment I'll make about the whole series, is if you watched it not knowing the ages and the timelines, you would think this was 1970s suburbia America, right? So it gives you that 1970s, maybe early 1980s feel of the way the house is, the way the car is, the way they dress, accepting. So the way they dress, accepting when he tries to break into black culture and dress more like them and be more like his idols in that. But yeah, the whole white part of it has a very 1970s feel, where someone would actually have a legitimate complaint about some of these things. So that was and obviously it was on purpose to give you that. And then you look up his age. He's and when these things actually happened, that was 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. Those were the 4 years there, which was actually probably the golden age of race relations.
Yeah.
Was those early 2000s, as we've talked about in previous episodes. So he then the grooming for the system, and then he goes into basically black athletes at the time, and he brings up Allen Iverson. And that's his example of systemic inherent racism when it comes to publicity of these athletes. And he puts it all to one event of why Allen Iverson was hated. And that's because he braided his hair. Okay. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that he constantly skipped practice. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that he had a lot of extracurricular activities off the court. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that he actually did a lot of outside the rules of the game stuff while playing the games. It was because he braided his hair. That's why he got the name Thug, which he goes into a definition of that and how it's being translated into today's politics. But I did want to point out with the Iverson thing, as he's going through this tirade about him braiding his hair and that being a bad thing, in the highlights he's showing Iverson's playing against other people with braided hair, like almost like other people were doing it at the time. But that was just something I noticed. I was like,
Well, yeah, and at the time, I don't remember exactly when this happened, but there was a period of time where it was quite the fad for white people did it. They got made fun of, but white people did it. A lot of them did it, and not just like
that's
Rachel
appropriation.
Dolezal. So,
that's appropriation. Then one thing I noticed, and he goes further into this later, but they're introducing these topics one thing at a time, right? Mm-hmm. And at the 16-minute mark, the mother comes up because he wants to get his hair braided. He goes to some kind of apartment that wasn't a hairstyling place, and she does a bad job. So mom decides she wants to kind of help him out. So she goes to her 2 black coworkers and starts asking all these questions about it. And there we're introduced to the topic of microaggressions, and again, I'm labeling these things before they're actually happening. I'm like, we're going to talk with this scene is going to be about this, and boom, it is. But then she takes him to a place that those 2 recommended, and it's an urban store that has a black clientele, and it's kind of like a thrift shop set up and has the barbershop in the back. And he just all of a sudden feels like he belongs. He never belonged where he was as the young black kid of 2 white parents, and all of a sudden feels like he belongs, which is where we introduce the concept of dual consciousness, the old W.E.B. Du Bois or Du Bois or Du Bois or however they want to say it. I've heard 4 different
jackass. No, I'm sorry.
Well, we're going to get to him more later because he's actually the start of episode 3. But when we look at someone like him as a writer, he was in the 1905, 1903, and he was a former slave.
Mm-hmm.
We have a guy who actually has a point with what he's writing about, but you're trying to apply it to 2004. It doesn't translate.
Yeah.
And then they go to another house of the hairstylist, because she says, "Oh, I'll do it at my house from here on out." And of course, she's gay, so the mom's reaction to that, again, the parents were thrown under the bus like crazy.
Yeah, and that's where I want to jump in, because that's what infuriated me. And I'm gonna get us in trouble here because we're not allowed to say this, but this is something that Jason Whitlock has been harping on lately a lot. Is hold on a second. We, as paraphrasing Jason Whitlock here, we as the black community say we're all about this, but yet we keep doing this when it comes to politics. So he has flat out said that a lot of black culture and black politics is satanic. Those are his words, is that it's satanic. And this was another thing where this is what got this going, is I snarkily shared Jason Whitlock's episode on the Kaepernick documentary with you, and tagged my favorite token black friend in it to annoy him because it amuses me, because I'm a very shallow and bad person, but that's not the point here. And this is part of that, is hold on, the black community is supposed to be all about family. I got you, fam. It's all about family. And yet here you have Colin Kaepernick throwing his family under the bus, excoriating his family, painting his family, his parents, as not just not good parents, but racists.
Well, not only that, I'm going to take that a step farther, is this whole community love type narrative to go along with this movement. His family that raised him isn't his real family. When he
Mhm.
walked into this store with all these people he didn't even know, but they were darker of skin, he all of a sudden felt at home. This is his family. This community is his family.
Mhm.
Even though he other than TV and sports on TV, he had no cultural connection to that side of the street, so to say. Uh, so again, it's introducing a lot of these concepts that are kind of foreign to people who think they know what they're talking about when they say I'm for social justice.
Yep.
They
But and this is social justice. I'm going to try not to get on off on a Kyle Rittenhouse rant here, but this is what social justice actually is, okay? And this should infuriate anyone, not just anyone who's a parent, but anyone who thinks about being a parent. The sacrifices you have to make to be the personal sacrifices you have to make to be a parent, doubly so if you're adopting, because you're making even more of a conscious decision to step outside of the basic biological imperative that we have. You're stepping outside of that and saying, I'm going to take someone who is not of my own genetics, but they are going to be my child.
Oh,
I'm going to
he
raise
goes
them
into
as
that
mine.
later on why on how that was even bad.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And
but when we look at the parents, so when we look at symbolism in art, right? And so we have to, even though it wasn't very good, we have to consider this art to some degree, and it is art with subtitles underneath, right? So sub meaning subtext, uh, on purpose, because it is meant to be an activist documentary, right? His parents are the personification of what is described as the well-meaning white person, right? Where they're still inherently racist. So I'm again paraphrasing "Are We Even Equal" and Ibn Kendi's work, and to some degree some of the other writers. But the statement that D'Angelo would make, you don't have to be racist to be supporting a racist system because of your implicit bias, right? So the reactions and the actions of the parents, even though they were well meaning, were very caricatured in a racist light. And so the parents in this whole documentary are the personification of this ideal of systemic racism without individual racism.
the white savior
The white
complex.
savior complex, yeah. Couple other notes from episode 1. When he was talking about being authentically black and having his hair done and everything, one of the things I noticed, and this is one of the parts of the conversation that very few people want to bring to the table. The only person I've ever seen kind of be aggressive about this is Coleman Hughes, and to some degree Glenn Lowry, is when he got his hair done and the mom went up to the front and they were going to get the hair products to make sure it was okay. Uh, it was like $sign, 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 $sign. And the mom's like adding up how much this is going to cost, but she wants to do it for her son. And I was like, that's part of the problem. These clothes in this place that they're at are all overpriced. The Air Jordans, the Air Force Ones, the FUBU, oversized shirts, and then the all of these things. You want to talk about grifting? If I want to say something that is systemically racist, the most grifted group of people in this country has been Black America when it comes to commercialization, and it's been done through sports, and been done mostly through sports, I would say, because their idols, the people that they say look like me and I can identify with, are up there selling it to them by wearing it. So that was one thing I kind of took from that, because all of these things that he kept saying, I finally feel at home, was like $sign after $sign after $sign too. And when you're spending more money on your hair products than on a car, it's kind of hard to drive yourself to work, right?
But this loops right back to the throwing the parents under the bus. So he's going to, he's going to paint his own freaking parents as these bigoted people, and yet, here's the mom looking at all these dollar signs, but she's willing to do it because this is my son and this is what I think he needs and wants. And you're going to throw him under the bus. And this isn't new. I don't know if anyone remembers, probably not, but back in like 2007, Barack Obama threw his own freaking grandmother under the bus as being a typical white person and being bigoted. This is the woman who helped raise you, because when his mom divorced the Indonesian man she was married to, where they lived for a while, and then moved to Hawaii with her parents, Barack Obama's grandparents. They helped raise him, and they helped pay for him to go to an exclusive private school. And you're going to throw her under the bus to make a racial point.
Well,
but yet the black community is supposed to be all about family.
Well, then subsequently, shortly after all of that, the baseball coach makes him cut his hair, and they brought up it was a baseball rule. You couldn't have hair coming out the back of your whatever. And this starts a string of events that I start through the rest of the whole series start saying, well, did this really happen? Because it's too perfect, right? It's too perfect for the narrative. Did this really happen? And if it did happen, was it not racist? Answer A, or was it racist? Answer B. And so that happened.
That was a point Whitlock made. He had a couple episodes on this, and he brought on, every guest he brought on who was also black, so they're allowed to talk about it even though we're not, said the same thing: is really this really happened? Give me a break. I don't believe it.
Oh, we've got a whole series of those. And he ends episode 1 with the statement, I didn't have the knowledge, wisdom, or language, which I underlined in my own notes because that's the key here with all the critical theories, is using language to fight back. So I didn't have the knowledge, wisdom, or language to fight back. Now I do. And that's how he ends that first episode. And again, it was kind of an intro to all these concepts with caricatures along the way.
So I guess the Yankees are racist because they make everyone cut their hair and be clean shaven,
which is what the dad said. Team rules and stuff, and that actually comes up later again too, because he apparently grows a little fuzz on his chin or whatever. But
there are a lot of people, whatever their race, who think that a gentleman should be clean shaven and have short hair. That there's not a race thing there. That's just the traditional old-fashioned perception of a lot of people.
Okay, so he opens episode 2 with this statement, and this is actually this kind of his own self-grandization. Is that the right word?
Yeah, whatever.
Where he thinks he's awesome, and if it doesn't work out, it's because something's against him, right?
Yeah.
He opens up with, you'd think going out and being clearly better than your competition would be enough. And so this describes the narrative from his own mouth with his NFL career, when he was benched for Gabbert and then not re-signed and then not signed to other teams.
You were benched for Blaine Gabbert.
Yeah.
Anyone who knows anything about football, that should be the final nail in the career coffin of Colin Kaepernick.
And he goes on to blame it on, again, his own words here. It's you only make it when you have the white man stamp of approval. And then again goes into some old 1930s references about mortgages and nice little 10 or
hold on. Something I think I mentioned when I ranted about Kaepernick way back in one of our first episodes is, all right, if you only make it if you have the white man stamp of approval, why isn't Tim Tebow still in the league?
because he didn't have the white man stamp of approval. He must not have been good. See, if it's a white
Seems
person
odd.
that's out of the league, they weren't as
Mhm,
good.
mhm.
So
There are a lot of similarities between the play style and the skill level of Tebow and Kaepernick, and yet Tebow is not this great cultural hero with a multi-million-dollar Nike contract or Reebok or whoever he's advertising. I can't remember.
well, and then he brings up wages and approvals for loans or
Mhm.
all of these different things that happened way back, and then makes it modern and talks about minimum wage again. And my first question that came out of my head is, he says, you don't get any more than that unless you have white man stamp of approval. I'm like, what if the boss is black? There's a lot of black owned businesses now where people
Well,
make
not
minimum
just
wage.
that, but this is something that Thomas Sowell has brought up a lot, is pointing out the disparity between black immigrants and native born black people,
Mhm.
and saying, hold on a
And
second.
you can go across any measurable too.
If it's all about
Yeah.
racism, then what does the racist white business owner care if you're a first or second generation from immigrant from Nigeria or the Caribbean versus if you're an American born black person? If he's a racist, what does he care? And yet the immigrant gets paid more. So perhaps it's has something to do with culture and attitude.
Or ability. That's where the
Yeah.
selection. See, the
Yeah.
argument against that is selection bias. These people were the cream of the crop that immigrated. So therefore they're automatically going to be
Right.
better.
But Soul's point is none of that matters if your point is this disparity is because of racism.
Yeah. And this
Because
is yeah, it's
yeah,
this is one where you get the what does they call it? Epistemic pushback. This is stressing me out to just talk about it kind of stuff. Let's see. He goes on to the story about his tryout for JV when he was a freshman. Of course, he's a freshman in high school trying out for JV, and he was passed up by the white quarterback because he was the prototype. And the coach used the word, he's prototypical QB. And so first, my two questions, again, this is one of those stories where I said, was this true? Did he go out there and just play lights out and the other guy sucked and the other guy still got picked? Or did they both play really well?
mm-hmm.
And the other guy had been to quarterback camps, new coaches, or this is where I said we would identify it, because everybody's played on a team that coach's son has been on, or something along those lines.
We rooted for one of those when we first went to Oklahoma State.
Yeah.
And the coach's son was the quarterback, and it drove us crazy.
No, he was the running back.
I thought he was the quarterback. No, you're right. He was the running back.
Yeah, because Fobbs was so much better. And what was it, Williams?
Yeah.
Yeah, Williams was the other guy. 1 yard gain down the middle on 3rd and 15.
But actually, what I first thought of when you started talking about this is, hold on, we just talked about this last time when we were talking about draft busts. Okay, the Dallas Cowboys chose Taco Charlton, not just someone with a silly name, but okay, so they chose the black guy over the white guy because he fit their system.
Mm-hmm.
Even though all the scouts were saying this other guy is a better football player, he's better at football, and he just got a huge extension. I'm still mad about it, but maybe that other quarterback got chosen because he fit their system. The coach didn't know how to coach Kaepernick.
Well, and also what we know about the current Kaepernick, was he the same in high school? Was he a dick to the coaches?
Yeah.
You know, as well, or this perfect little kid he's depicted as in this show, right?
Maybe they didn't care that Kaepernick was more athletic because the other guy was a better passer, and that's what they cared about.
Or he was a better teammate, maybe. That could have been part of it. Or again, how was the tryout? Was it as depicted in the show where one was playing well, the other sucked, or were they both good? Mm-hmm. Were they both good? One looked like a better teammate. One seemed to have a better grasp of the offense, or one maybe he wasn't competing against another freshman. They didn't even specify that in the show. Was the guy already a sophomore or junior trying out for JV versus the freshman kid trying to come in and play?
And maybe the coaches just sucked. That happens a lot because there's a lot of youth sports out there, and just the idea of the bell curve, there aren't going to be that many elite quality coaches. There just aren't enough to go around.
Well, and then okay, so I'm gonna hop forward in time on the show and then come back to something. But about 10 minutes later, he goes into what is the prototype, right? And this is something I think we probably would agree with him on, because we talked about it in our last football talk with Drew Brees versus Phillip Rivers. They brought Phillip Rivers in because Drew Brees wasn't a prototypical quarterback, but Phillip Rivers was 6'4" and 230 pounds, right? And so this is where we do kind of agree. And he's like, what is the prototype? But then he goes off on this tangent of, not only is it what they think the position should be, which is what we're thinking of when we talk about prototype.
Peyton Manning, yeah,
that guy who's tall enough to see over the lineman, who is stout enough to take a hit every once in a while, has the big arm, all of those things that you think of. Again, Peyton Manning, Phillip Rivers, even Ben Roethlisberger. He came from a small school, but he got his job because he had the build and stature of a prototypical pocket passer, and he turned out to be successful. It worked, right? But then you got someone like Ryan Leaf, who pretty much fell off into obscurity, even though he was technically a prototypical quarterback. So we would agree up until he starts saying they want someone that looks like them, and now he's including White. White is part of that prototype, which undoubtedly there are coaches that probably make that decision. We're not saying this thing doesn't exist, but in this exact situation, was it the fact that the other kid was tall? We don't know if he was older. We don't know how he performed in the tryout versus what was depicted. But Colin Kaepernick, he was 6'2". I don't know how fast he grew. He was 6'2" as a pro, but he was small. Yeah. He was 180, 175 pounds or so coming out of high school, 180 pounds coming out of high school. So as a freshman, the guy's probably a twig.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about prototype, was it White, or was it the fact that you looked frail?
That's a big concern with a lot of people. Less so now with how the NFL keeps changing the rules to put all the quarterbacks in skirts. So it's less of an issue now, but that has long been an issue. That was one of the concerns coming out into the draft for Robert Griffin. Is a lot of people said this guy is not a big guy. He's not a muscular guy. Is he going to be able to take a hit? And one of the reasons that Vince Young was rated so highly is because he was a big guy. He could take a hit. He had demonstrated that in college.
Yeah. So again, there's things that were kind of just brushed aside when we evaluate football talent, and we'll get into this even more later because of his. Well, let me go in order, but we're gonna touch on that again later, because that's a big thing. His size was one of the biggest issues with his football career. If you really look at how things played out, let's assume everything he said about his tryouts were true. If you're a coach and you're seeing someone who's smaller and frailer by the actual numbers that existed, then that's actually, it is a concern on the football field. And then finally he wins. So I'm leaping back in time on the show. His dad comes through for him again.
It's racist dad.
His racist dad gets him through a connection of a connection of a connection in front of one of the best quarterbacks coaches in the area. And he goes to this camp all summer and comes back and finally wins the job. And then that's kind of how that episode ends. He wins the job. But then,
which just completely undermines what he just said previously. Hold on.
But he wins the job later, not his freshman year. He ends up playing freshman ball.
But the point being, they wanted a quarterback who looked like them. But then you go to a camp and spend all this time training and honing
get
your
better and
skills,
improve your ability,
and then you win the
job.
Confused.
Yeah. but he credits winning the job to the stuff, to the fact that his dad played the politics along with it, talking to one of the coaches saying he trained with this such and such guy and da da da. So he kind of gives that more credit than his actual play for winning the job, because you can't be a victim otherwise if you go out and perform well and get the job. Right. So that's how that one ends. And then he opens the next episode with Mr. W.E.B. Du Bois on labor during Black Reconstruction. And he goes on a long tirade there. But again, it's another example of taking something that happened back in 1905 and saying that's how it is in 2005, which there's you know, the distance between the Wright brothers and landing on the moon was only like 60 years. A lot's changed since then. You got something queuing up, or you want me to go on?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So here's where they start getting funny with the camera work too, to kind of just put subliminal stuff in your head. He's going over the Du Bois quote, basically reading from him about segregation and Jim Crow, and superimposing on that. So they're showing pictures of lynchings and the different crap that happened during that day that we can all agree is bad, but superimposing that with things like the McCloskeys. Remember who they were?
Were those the people in St. Louis during the BLM riots who went out on their front porch and then
they had brandished their weapons on the front porch when rioters busted down their gate?
Yeah, and the rioters weren't prosecuted, but they were.
Yeah. So they're superimposing these things from today on, again, pictures of lynchings and crosses burning and all this. So personally, I've made a little note here that said lawsuit ? Because that's kind of slander or
it absolutely is. Yeah, it absolutely is. And it's also absurd. Okay, so you get a couple of white people with a nice house during a riot, go out in their yard brandishing weapons saying, get off our property or we will shoot you. They don't actually shoot. They don't even discharge their firearms. And yet they are prosecuted, not the people who were clearly violating the law and damaging these people's property. And yet somehow this is supposed to show us that systemic racism is real. Now, I want to contrast this with something that I was thinking about as you've been talking. We've mentioned Shelby Steele's White Guilt before. Great book that everyone needs to read. And he opens it with a story of actual prejudice and racism. That when he was a young kid, you know, a young boy, his dream was to be the bat boy for his local minor league team. Okay. And he just went and did it, which was awesome and amusing to me. Is he just started going to the practices and just started doing it. And then so finally he was kind of accepted as, all right, so he's our bat boy. So this little black kid for a white minor league team, and he's their bat boy. And then comes a time where they're going on an away game, but they're going to a place that doesn't allow black people in the stadium. And he just shows up, and his parents had kind of warned him that, you know, be ready for disappointment, but he just shows up, and the manager has to have a talk with him and say, sorry, we can't take you. And that's actual prejudice to a child. You know, to an elementary school child is being legitimately discriminated against purely for the color of his skin. And Kaepernick and the people who made this crap are going to try and compare what he went through in the late 90s, early 2000s to that. That's insulting and obscene.
Well, and again, we're about to go into a string of events that kind of correlate with that to some degree. Before that, he he makes sure to highlight that his parents are Bush fans and support the Patriot Act, and because he's reading from a newspaper and like, oh, he did that, oh, that's great, oh no, no. Like, okay, so they had to make sure that you don't like the parents anymore again after the last episode where dad comes through, but then we go into a string of events where again, this is the, did that really happen that way? It just seems too good for the story. If it really did happen that way, I understand the way he feels, but I kind of doubt it, especially with, like the Braun and the Smollett kind of stuff that goes on with this whole movement. But he goes to a hotel there. So now they're traveling around with his select baseball team that he's on. Because he was an amazing baseball player. And so they're traveling for that the summer tournaments, and they're at a hotel and they're giving out ice cream to the baseball players, but they only get one each. And his buddy, who's white, is there and goes up and gets seconds, comes back. He's like, oh, you got another one? Oh, so he goes up there to get seconds, and the lady's like, I've seen you before. You can't have this. You've already had one. And then the buddy goes back up again and gets another one. And so there's one. And then they're at another hotel for another game. And that same buddy goes up and gets some cookies, and it's like, oh, these are amazing. And he goes up to get a cookie, and the manager comes up, who are you? Get out of here. You're stealing stuff. And then then he goes into his monologue that I think I did watch the Jason Whitlock thing you put up, just to say I did. And he plays the video of the microaggressions. Am I thinking of the right thing?
Yeah.
It was in there. Okay, so that's where that came from. He goes into that monologue on microaggressions where he's getting the nice stiff drink from the white waiter and everything, talking about microaggressions,
which was bizarre,
but giving the history of it from a scholar point of view, quoting Chester Pierce and some of the other older critical race scholars. But then, so his dad drives every time. And then finally he's got a permit. So his dad says, hey, you can drive this time. And so they go through all the other tournaments. Dad drives by the same cop and obviously speeding a little bit, but the cop's just like, see you later. So now he's driving and they pass that same cop pulls him over. And this is where it's such a caricature of what is going to happen. Cop looks in the car, sees the two white parents with the quote unquote, I hate calling Kaepernick black because he's really not black, but especially as a young kid with a shaved head, he probably looked like he had just a good tan. But he looks in the car and he's like, are you two okay? Is this guy, and the parents are like, yeah, we're okay. We're fine. And I'm like, it's too far. It's too much. Like any cop's going to pull that kid over who's obviously, 15, 16 years old. Because we know he was smaller. He was tall, but he was smaller. He wasn't like a commanding presence with these two older people, and not assume that they're his caretakers of some kind. The way they portrayed it was like the cop thought he was some black guy kidnapping two old white people. And again, this is 2004. This isn't 1904.
Where was this? Remind me, where did Kaepernick grow up?
It's someplace in Southern California. I know it was a predominantly white area, but he was born in Wisconsin.
This isn't rural Alabama, for crying out loud.
Yeah. So again, it was just that caricature. And then so the dad finally is like, no, he's got his permit and he's driving today. And the cop says, well, let me see your permit. And of course he reaches down to get his permit. The cop jumps back with his hand on his gun, is like, hey, slow down there. Like again, too gosh darn perfect. Right. Again, is this a true story? Or is it just what they want the narrative to be? So they're telling the story, right? And he said, and of course, you're not allowed to question it because it's his story. It's his lived experience.
His truth.
He may have, quote unquote, felt that way while looking back upon it, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but then eventually the dad talks to the cop again, and the cop just says, okay, well, don't do it again. And so he makes it very obvious that the only reason he got out of the ticket was that the dad was there talking to the cop. Uh, and then they go into another one where they go to another hotel, and the manager is staring him down the whole time. But then a team of all black kids comes to that same hotel, and the management keeps harassing them, like, you quit making all that noise, while they're showing teams of white kids wrestling around and stuff, not getting bothered by the management. So again,
Mhm.
is this a true story? And if it is a true story, did it happen this way? uh, and of course the coach from the black team is talking to Kaepernick, and he says, oh yeah, we got kicked out last time we were in here. And he's like, kicked out? Why? And he said, well, of course, why do you even have to ask? We're kicked out for being black. And again, 2004, not 1904, where that kind of thing would actually happen.
Mhm.
uh Having quotes one of the good ones. I'm trying to remember what that was from. I might have to watch the end of that episode.
What contrast that with? Have you seen the movie 42?
No, I haven't.
Okay, it's a good movie, but I was really hoping that Harrison Ford's part would have been bigger and more impactful, because Ricky Branch is one of the most incredible figures in baseball history. Um, he basically invented spring training and the farm system. Okay, and that's where he made his money. Is with the St. Louis Cardinals and basically inventing spring training and the farm system. Um, but he started out as a devout Methodist at Wesleyan University, I think it was, which was a Methodist school. He's a devout Methodist. Um, so an early uh, an early advocate for equality and civil rights based on a Christian worldview. And he has this story that he'll repeat later, from when he was a college baseball coach. And this is one of the things that inspired him to look for a black player to put on the Brooklyn Dodgers, as they go to a hotel and they're denied because one of the players on the team is black. And and they have to go somewhere else. Or no, I think Branch eventually talks the manager into letting the player stay, and he'll sign for him, and the player will stay with him in his room, so that the manager doesn't have to give this black kid his own room, and that he can stay with him. And 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 so Branch sends the kid off to his room, and he goes in later, and he finds the kid scratching at his skin, and just tears streaming down his face, and saying, it's my skin, it's my skin. If I could only just pull it off so that I wouldn't have to go through with this. And it cut Ricky Branch to the core, because he saw the emotion, he saw what it was doing to this young man that Branch had great affection for, because he was, Branch was kind of the fatherly figure as the manager of this college baseball team. And and that inspired him to go on later in his life to get Jackie Robinson onto the Dodgers. And and those kinds of stories, compared to what Kaepernick is describing in his documentary of, did this really happen? And even if it happened the way you said it did, does it really compare to that, you
Mhm.
piece of garbage?
I remember what one of the good ones was, and it's actually a very important point, because at the end of that, he goes out and he throws a no hitter on that in that last tournament, and one of the employees at the hotel, they're all swimming in the pool, him and his teammates, and comes up and is like, "Hey, great game, good job, uh, and you've been really cool, and thank goodness you're one of the good ones, one of the good ones." And then he goes on a rant about assimilation, about being the acceptable black person, black man, and that's a white man's creation. And we've been on our rant about assimilation here because we all assimilate.
Mhm.
You know, there is a best way to live in the culture you grow up in, and we all have to do that, no matter what our genetics are, no matter what our physical makeup is, our phenotype is. So, but then he ends with a threat in that episode, and it was a quote from somebody else, and I didn't write who he was quoting, but it was, "Beware the day they change their mind," about being one of the good ones, about holding back and being peaceful. So he goes on his rant about assimilation, and then talks about the pacifist movements and everything. And he says, "Beware the day they change their mind." And I was like, "Oh, that sounds like a little bit of a threat thrown in there, since you're one of the leaders of this movement. I think you would be a pretty big influence if a whole group of people decided to change their mind about being peaceful." But episode 4, I don't really have a whole lot on that one, because except for the main point of it, because like it was just kind of more of the same shit, more stories that you're like, did that even happen the way he's saying? Really wasn't a whole lot of substance to it,
Mhm.
except he starts going into the whole the gist of his issues with athletics, because he was amazing at baseball. He was sought after for almost every major university in the country coming out of high school, and the Chicago White Sox coming out of high school. But he was dead set on playing football, to the point where he wanted to quit baseball just to play football. And when you really break it down, watching that episode and just kind of knowing the history of his athletic career to some degree, which I actually had to look up some of it, but his problem wasn't being black. His problem was he chose the wrong sport. And as with any great athlete, you're good at more than one sport, but at the same time, he chose a sport where being big and strong plays into the equation. And he wasn't. He was talented, but he did not have those measurables, and those measurables are going to matter. Even if they don't matter on the field, they're going to matter to the scouts, no matter who you are, no matter what skin color you are, no matter any other issue. If you're not 6'4", 230 pounds, you're automatically looked at a little differently as a quarterback.
Yeah. And it's one of my favorite players of all time, Doug Flutie, whiter than I am. And he didn't, I feel, get a fair shake because he was a little guy, very little. I mean, I think he's littler than Drew Brees is.
He was shorter. He was stockier.
Yeah. He was shorter than even Drew Brees, but he was a good scrambler. He was a very accurate passer, but he was a very little guy. And so he, even though he had success in the Canadian League, the NFL didn't really ever give him a chance, except the Bills and the stupid Music City Miracle, where he wasn't even playing. Tangent rant, but again, that had nothing to do with color. He was not big enough to play the position. Drew Brees is one of the rare exceptions, and again, it had to do more with Sean Payton than anything
else. I was
else.
Gonna say, if Doug Flutie had found a Sean Payton, he might have had a similar career.
Is Drew Brees is the rare exception because he found the guy that said, no, this guy is incredibly accurate and I can work with him. We can do something here, because the Chargers got rid of him.
That was my takeaway from episode 4. And that's kind of the theme going on, is it's hard for me to empathize with his position. When the actual story is he had it pretty damn good in life, and he was highly sought after for his baseball skills, but he just wanted to play football. His oppression was his choice.
Mhm.
He would have been a millionaire out of high school had he played baseball. His oppression was the fact that he chose the harder path for him specifically
Yeah.
because of his size. Uh, and realistically, if you're an amazing pitcher, it is actually easier to stand out than it is in a more complex situation like a
Yeah.
football field as a quarterback, because there's so many other different factors that go into running a scheme in a football situation than having an amazing arm and an ability to pick the right pitches. The more you specialize, the easier it is to pull away from the pack, right?
Yeah. Well, in the last couple of episodes here where we've been talking about sports and the NFL specifically, how many times have we brought up quarterbacks that were the next big franchise quarterback that completely flopped,
Mm-hmm.
especially if they went to the Cleveland?
Uh, he lays it on a little thick at the end because he's with that same friend that got the cookies, and the guy apparently has been running some stealing hubcaps and selling them thing, and he's like, well, why don't you ever include me? And he's like, because I'll get arrested, you'll get shot, is what he told him. I was like, oh, there we go.
Really?
They kind of thrust
Really?
that in there. Yeah, the
Yeah.
data doesn't suggest that, but it's a story. uh Episode 5, it's where he takes the girl to the prom, and she was too black for his parents. I don't think we need to go too deep into that. But he does go into implicit bias, the doll test that they give the kids dolls, and they always pick the white one. Uh, all the tip again. You can go through a D'Angelo book, and you've got the script already. Uh, more instances where you wonder if it's the truth, because apparently the parents reacted badly to him taking the really black girl instead of the other girl to the prom. Uh, this is the episode where he really throws his mom under the bus. Like, holy shit, really bad, because she
Yeah.
comes out as a really racist asshole. Uh,
After all the stuff that she'd done for you, you're a great guy, Cap.
yeah, and I did make a note that some of the things he's throwing her under the bus for were concepts he probably didn't even consider or know till he got indoctrinated in college into this whole system. Uh, he blames a lot of that on media saturation of negative images of black people. So again, it's just kind of textbook stuff. Oh, and then he ends it with a positive note that 2019 was the first time that all the world's major beauty queens were black. So every single one of them. And I was like, okay. And he goes on to talk about how that is because of black excellence, not because there's a whole movement that says if you don't do that, you're going to be canceled. But again, so this is the first introduction of what the term quote unquote black excellence. Like, there is something about that skin tone that makes you better than everybody else, which is kind of the other side of this whole movement, that not only are we equal, or should we be equal, but we're even better than you.
There's definitely a racial superiority element to
Mhm.
this entire movement that is grotesque, frankly.
It's becoming the monster they say they're fighting, is really is
Mhm,
what it
mhm.
is. And the person we were talking about earlier on social media has been guilty of this. And you'll see something perfectly reasonable about, hey, we can do math just like you, we can do this, we can do that, we can do that, and this is a great example of black excellence. I'm like, no, it's an example of we're all humans,
Mhm.
and we can learn the same things. We all have adapted
It's
similarly.
this is something again that Shelby Steele brings up in White Guilt, that it is kind of a new spin on an old idea. A lot of people have lamented the degree, the percentage of success of Black Americans in sports and entertainment. But Steele spins it a different way, and he says, hold on a second, look at it this way. Look what we can accomplish when all that matters are the results.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's There are absolutely no prejudices or politics when it comes to, can you sing? Can you play an instrument? Can you shoot a basketball? Can you run fast? All that matters is the result and the amount of work you're willing to put into your talent to get that result.
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought was a great insight of, look what happens when you get the political and racial nonsense out of the way and you just focus on working hard and cultivating your skill.
Now, I've only got about 10 more minutes, and the last episode is where we go into you were talking about the adoption, where these two people took on this person and the importance of family. So they actually went above and beyond just two people accidentally having a child, right? And we see this across the board with adopted parents in general. So Heather Heying on in an interview where she was being interviewed with Jordan Peterson as well, brought up, because they were talking about gay couples, and she brought up the fact that gay parents tend to actually be very exceptional parents because they had to go out of their way to choose to have a child versus two people who just had sex and ended up having a child, right? So they actually had to plan a process out and really want to have a child. So they tend to actually be on the high end of the loving spectrum with their children, even though they're not genetically associated with that child. But again, it was the fact that they actually had to want the kid versus just two people copulating and not taking the proper precautions, right? He tells a story, and again, this is it true? Apparently, those two parents were trying to adopt other kids and kept getting denied last minute because the kid got taken, and they would have preferred a white child. I really want to see the parents come out and say yes or no to a lot of these accusations.
But how could you as a parent? Even, I mean, it's your child. To screw the fact that you're
adopted. How could you in
adopted.
today's environment? Because there's the narrative that denial is truth, or denial is guilt, right? But so he opens up with a statement. Since the day I was born, I've never been anybody's first choice. To which I added, wah, because that's what I heard there. Wah. Of course you're adopted. You weren't the choice of your parents. Well, that's nuanced because dad left without even sticking around till the end of the pregnancy, and mom may or may not have had the ability. She may have done you the better service, and she may have known that.
Yeah, and she may have not wanted
probably
to do that
ripped her apart. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, since the day I was born, I've never been anybody's first choice. Wah, wah, wah. Even though, again, go back to the previous episode, all these baseball teams were trying to recruit you and pay you millions of dollars. They were your second choice. They were I can't imagine he wouldn't have taken one of those offers if he never got the offer from Nevada to play football, right? So if you really break it down, they were the second choice. He had the choice. The world is out of my control because of society is precisely why some of these people are failing. He was in the captain's seat when it came to all this, and his problems were self-made, and glad they worked out for him when it came to football, because he ended up going to the NFL, which is awesome. Who else can say that, right? How many other people? I made a little note here from my strength and conditioning background. When they're doing the agility drills in the show, whoever coached these kids up on the 3-cone and the 5-10-5s and stuff was amazing. So whoever did that, kudos to you. So the unsung heroes of any documentary. And if it was Kaepernick, you may have a job in strength and conditioning. So you can always fall back on it. It doesn't make any money though. Oh, okay. So one of the notes I made in at these combines and these college combines and stuff, he's always shown next to these other guys, and he's tiny compared to these guys, which would lead me to go back to our other point. That's why he wasn't recruited, not because it's black, right? But the other part was, I'm like, well, he's also supposed to be 6'2", right? That's not tiny.
No.
Unless all these guys are 6'6" and above, then but he's trying to give that underdog vibe, right?
Right.
I understand that. That's kind of how these documentaries go. And then I put a note again. He keeps harping on no one will give me a shot, and then I put ... as he's passing up on baseball.
As he's getting a multi-million-dollar contract to do advertising for, I think it's Nike that he's doing now, but
well, Nike is what started all this. Nike, he had the contract with Nike for the whole stand up for something campaign
that's
before he ever kneeled.
Yeah.
Which was, I can't believe everybody doesn't discredit the whole thing just based on that, but that's just me.
Something I was thinking about as a contrast to this nonsense, and especially when he was throwing his parents under the bus, is it reminded me of The Blind Side, which is a decent movie. It's gotten a lot of criticism for its creative license compared to the book. But the part that really jumps out at you is when the NCAA investigator is grilling Michael Orr and is concerned because what if this starts a rash of boosters going out and adopting urban ghetto kids so they can get them to go to their alma mater. It's like, but would that necessarily be a bad thing? These kids need parents. Okay. They need parents who are going to look after them and care for them. And you're painting this as a bad thing because my family is white, as Michael Orr, even though he was adopted, way later in life as a teenager, that's his family. Color be damned.
Yeah, motivation matters in some things, because you would question the amount of actual love and care they would get in that situation. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it's really pan or the fire at that point, because if they are inner city, uncared for to begin with, I mean, shoot, that's a tough, that would be a nice long ethics and morality debate that I would love to see between someone who's more versed in the psychology behind parent-child interactions, because which is worse, being neglected in one arena or being neglected in another, but it's actually a better life, So that would be an interesting topic. I think I would love to see some people with more expertise on that cover. But yeah, you do have a point. Why is it bad? Well, we do need to discuss that, because it is all about the child in the end, and which is going to have the better outcome. I don't know. Yeah. So to summarize the whole thing, it's luckily they're only 30-minute episodes, so it made it more bearable to watch all 6. But there's a lot of, did this really happen? Because he did kind of live a privileged life.
Yeah.
And some of those situations were very much too good to be true when it comes to the narrative. And the fact that you're not even supposed to question it is part of the issue. But then add to that, it was an outline of a whole doctrine, textbook doctrine that with basically character roles played by his parents, played by his coaches, played by him, played by all the what he would call positive influences in his life, where he was finding basically, I'm going to use the words finding his blackness. And then he ends it with trust your power, love your blackness. And like, what does that even mean?
Yeah. And I'm not the first one to say this, but if you want to know if something is racist, change the colors in the phrase and then ask yourself, is that racist? So if you just swap out black for white, would that be racist, what he just said? Yes, it would.
Yeah.
So is it racist the way it was said? Yes, it is. It's also dangerous and disappointing. Sage Steele got fired for basically saying, look, I'm biracial and I'm proud and happy of that fact, and that's my heritage. By pointing out, basically, why is Barack Obama so obsessed with the father that left him? Why is Kaepernick so obsessed with the father that left him? You actually have parents that loved you and raised you, and you're throwing them under the bus. Why are you so obsessed? And the reason he's so obsessed is because he has been surrounded by an ideology that has warped his mind into becoming obsessed with that.
Yeah, and the I guess one of the major things is one kind of concept we've been talking about with this whole movement is a lot of times you see them creating the problem they say exists. And his problem with success in football was the fact that he chose the harder road, which if he just told that story without adding the social justice aspect to it, it'd be a slightly motivational story because, hey, I really wanted to be an NFL quarterback. I was a better baseball player. That exists, but I chose the harder road because it was my passion, right? So just like someone who's good with numbers could go be an successful accountant, but maybe they want to start their own business and do something completely different. And they ended up being successful and now they're Elon Musk or something, right? So that would have been a slightly motivational story if it was more well done, because it also was a crappy just documentary to begin but other than the 3-cone drills and the athletic drills, it was poorly performed across the board. But he chose the path that was going to be more problematic for himself, and he knew that as a child, if he's telling the truth in this documentary. So his problems weren't his blackness in this world. His problems were the fact that we're basically a byproduct of his own choices,
which is a universal human trait.
Yeah, well, let me even expand that just a little bit. His problem was the product of his own choices when his choices were be a super successful high-level football player or be a multi-million-dollar baseball player. This is a position of privilege, I would say.
Yeah.
Not only genetic privilege, but also the family that he threw under the bus here, supplying the means to that, because you don't play select baseball for free. You don't do all of those things. Yeah, you don't.
It's a lot of work and a lot of money.
You don't go to a quarterback camp of one of the best quarterback coaches in California for free. His hardships in life, we'll just call them first world problems.
Yeah. It's a good way to sum that up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think you're about out of time, aren't you?
Yeah. So, well, technically over out of time, but I don't see anybody walking up to.
Well, we'll wrap it up there. We'll get to Murray later, which I think is a good place to tease off and leave off of. You think you got problems? The cohorts, the people that Murray is talking about in coming apart, they have real problems. They don't have the privilege that you had, son.
Okay, I just wanted to bring this up to close us out because of that whole idea of the plantation, where apparently the slaves on the field can still make their $30 million a year, while not playing and being under investigation for some very, very bad activities.
Mhm.
While what would they call the guy out there? Not the owner of the plantation, but the guy with the whip.
Overseer.
The overseer. The overseer loses his job because he sent some emails with some not desirable topics.
Mhm.
That's how much of a plantation it is. And when you talk about losing and a disconnect between your narrative and the fan base, that's where it is.
Yep.
Or Odell Beckham Jr. just got released by the Browns, and they're talking about, oh, yeah, he didn't get the white man stamp of approval. He also got $4.5 million for not playing, and he can go somewhere else and sign for a new contract.
Yep.
That sounds like the slave trade to me. But who are we? We must be just jealous because we're poor white people. Well, not poor, but we're
No.
not $1 million, multi-million-dollar white people. I don't know.
Yep. Yep. Just trying to figure out how to pay our bills.
Yeah, it's our white fragility. I need to get my cat of nine tails and whip myself on the back a few times. Might be kinky. I don't know.
Giggity.
All right, that's a good place to close, though. But yeah, I bit the bullet, did it, watched it, and I don't think there were very many surprises there. But
And we all thank you for your sacrifice.
yay!
And we'll see y'all next time.
See you next time.